The next guest we've got joining us from Canada. It is Azfar Ali Khan, who's the Director of Performance for the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. And our next session after that starts at 11:30, so I'm just going to flag we've got about 15 minutes. It's going to feel a bit like intellectual speed dating, I think. If you've got a question for Azfar, get it into the pigeonhole straight away, otherwise I'm not going to have a chance to see it. So I'm going to pause here and hope. Here he is, Azfar, welcome. We can't hear you, sorry.
Oh, you can?
Yep, there we go. Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. There's probably plenty of people in the room who may not be as well aware of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy as I am. So how about we get started with 90 seconds or less on what you do and the work that you do that led us to reach out to you.
Oh, sure, delighted. So I work at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, not-for-profit think tank, and really our area of expertise is in public finance and government spending and value for money. So we really are working on two key areas here. A lot of work in terms of First Nations and First Nation child welfare, but also infrastructure, and that's really what led you to us. So we were asked by Infrastructure Canada probably about a year and a half ago to look at developing a methodology that any jurisdiction, be it national, subnational, municipal, or any foreign government can undertake with respect to conducting an infrastructure needs and performance assessment. So we took about probably a good 9 to 10 months, researched a lot of best practices, visited the UK a couple of times, and have had ongoing discussions with colleagues and peers in New Zealand and Australia. And we've developed this methodology. We're pretty happy with it. I'm very excited to share the output with you all.
Well, thanks for that sort of brief intro. And anyone who hasn't seen the report and the work that they do, you should jump onto their website. But as far maybe a quick summary of what the infrastructure environment in Canada is like, and what the current sort of level of ambition, if you like, from the federal government is there. We've been talking a lot this morning here about the Australian context and challenges around capacity and the ambition of the program. So perhaps just a quick lay of the land in Canada.
Yeah, happy to. So if I take a look at the last 5 years of infrastructure investment spending, it's totaled in terms of public and private about $85 billion Canadian annually over the last 5 years. 3/4 of that is public investment and 1/4 is private. In terms of the public spend, it's been directed mainly towards transportation infrastructure, electrical power infrastructure, and institutional buildings. The private sector, conversely, has been investing in communications network first and foremost, electrical power, and then, quite distressingly, they've actually continued to invest in oil and gas engineering construction infrastructure. That was a bit of a surprise to me. But so that's kind of the past history that we've had over the last 5 years. In terms of the ambition moving forward, Infrastructure Canada is really in the second half of its Investing in Canada plan. That plan is looking to invest $188 billion over a 12-year period from 2016 to 2028. It's got 5 streams of investment: public transit, green infrastructure, social infrastructure, trade and transportation infrastructure, and finally rural and northern communities. The objectives that are kind of underlying that plan are really to generate economic growth and really benefits for the middle class in particular, strengthening the resilience of our communities and starting to transition towards a clean growth economy. And finally, really looking at trying to improve social inclusion and ensuring that socioeconomic outcomes are enjoyed by all Canadians. In terms of the provinces, the province of Ontario is looking at spending another $140 billion over a 10-year period from 2019 to 2029. Quebec similarly is looking at $143 billion over 10 years from 2022, I believe, to 2032. The remaining provinces really have no investment plans of their own. They're really just looking to invest their allocations from the Investing in Canada plan. The one other point I would make in terms of your discussion around ambition, we're going to be tabling our federal budget next week. And Melinda, I'm pretty sure that infrastructure will not be a priority. It really hasn't been talked about at the federal level too much since 2016 or 2017 or so. Next week, I think really the focus is going to be on cost of living and inflation.
Themes that we could talk about here as well. One of the things, Azfar, that we've had a lot of conversation with you about is the work that IFSD has been doing on measuring the return on investment of public spending and really getting value for the public spend, if you like, in an increasingly challenging fiscal environment. You know, the numbers that you've just thrown out are absolutely huge numbers. So I'm just interested in, you know, what's the work that you've been doing on looking at the value of those projects, the return on those projects? Is the taxpayer getting what they should from those projects? And there's actually a specific question from the audience that can make this quite pointed, if you like, which is around the Ontario line investment project, which isn't scheduled to be completed for another 8 or so years. And how do you think about value for those very sort of long-dated projects?
It's a great question, and it was really something that we struggled with respect to developing our methodology. But what we really came up with, which we think is maybe a little bit unique and interesting, is we identified 3 key elements of return on investment. The first is to develop a well-being-based outcome performance measurement framework. So the context for that is we were actually in a position where we were able to brief our previous infrastructure minister on some of our best practices and what we found. And what struck us is in that first meeting with her, one of her comments was she had all of these individual investments, almost stacked on her desk with respect to the Investing in Canada plan, but she said she couldn't make the connection between any individual submission and how it's actually going to move the ball further down the field with respect to some of Canada's long-term commitments. She couldn't make that connection. So that really struck us. So the intent of this performance measurement framework is to really try to say, okay, we've got our quality of life, which is our ultimate outcome. And below that, using the IMF frame, we're trying to get strategic outcomes around economic growth, inclusion, sustainability, and resilience. So we've tried to identify indicators around those 4 strategic outcomes, not just for today, but out into the future. So that's really the first element. The second element is really to get a comprehensive understanding of the performance of your existing infrastructure stock. We're really kind of struck in terms of our conversations both with the UK and you good folks in Australia who've done a few of these needs assessments that when you look at to 2050, I think the numbers that we heard back from the 2 jurisdictions were that 80 to 85% of the infrastructure that you'll need in 2050 is already built and in the ground. So if you're undertaking an infrastructure needs and performance assessment, it really behooves us, I think, to take a good, long, hard look at, well, what actually is the performance of the existing stock? So in our methodology, we've identified a number of performance elements. I think some of the core ones around capacity, condition, and function, we all understand. We also tried to identify indicators, again, around inclusion, sustainability, resilience, and because we're accountants and public finance folks, around value for money as well. So we're looking at the cost to the taxpayer, to your point, looking at life cycle cost performance, the quality of the infrastructure services that are being received by residents and citizens, benefits realization, and finally, something called asset optimization performance, which, if I'm to be honest, is just how we translated sweating the assets from Australian into Canadian, because we absolutely love that vernacular that we heard from you. And so now in the third element that we've got, just one last point I'll make about the performance of the existing stock. Those performance elements are meant to be dynamic. Cyber resilience is one of the performance elements. It would not have been there 15 years ago. So there's never an intent that this should be static. The world is changing, so as we think about our existing stock, that will need to change as well. And the final element is really looking at the future needs. So we've got your classic infrastructure planning elements around demographics, our economy and how that's transitioning, climate change impacts, and then another element where we've tried to say, well, can we start to understand innovation, be it technological innovation, social innovation, or environmental innovation, and how that is moving along that continuum of pie in the sky to, okay, this looks kind of interesting, to, this looks like it could be actually economically viable, to, okay, this is actually going to impact how Canadians work, live, and play, and at scale. So can we get an early line of sight into how Canadians work, live, and play could be changing and changing at scale, so that we can start to be a little bit more proactive rather than reactive. So in terms of us thinking about return on investment, we take these three elements, the performance of the existing stock, a well-being performance measurement framework, and the future needs analysis, and we're trying to understand, well, what are the benefits and impacts as it relates to economic growth, sustainability, inclusion, and resilience. So when we think about our fiscal capacity and our fiscal arena, what we're trying to do is we're saying, okay, across the entire spectrum of well-being outcomes, economic, social, environmental, the entire portfolio of infrastructure asset classes, can we select those investments and sustaining capital allocations that are optimizing public value? So our lens on return on investment is really to try to look at it in terms of resource allocation ex ante, before the money's been spent rather than ex post. So that's really where our focus is.
So I've got two follow-up questions on that, Azfar. One that's come from the audience that goes to specifically of one aspect of how you think about that, and then another question which I'll come to that came up in our previous session. But one of the questions from the audience is, how do you put a demographic lens over those three factors that you were sort of just talking to in terms of the well-being goals, the performance of the existing stock, and then the sort of future readiness, if you like. So I guess it's like, how do you think about the intergenerational dynamics of the infrastructure in your model?
Yes, what we do is we try to really grab it into a local view, because in our minds there's no one thing as an infrastructure gap, like no one infrastructure gap. It really starts with people, place, and assets. So spatially, we start to take a look at those individual kind of parcels of land, whether it be a rural community or an urban center as well, and really trying to get a demographic lens around what does that population look like right now, and what will it continue to look like over the next 5 to 10 years. So a lot of our urban centers, Canada is an aging country, we really need to rely on immigration. As we start to take a look at that demographic lens and citizen priorities, we strongly suspect, and COVID really kind of reinforced this as well, that health infrastructure is going to continue to be more and more important for us as well. So the demographic lens, I think, Melinda, is we try to take a very, very specific spatial approach to that, to say who are the people, where are they living, and really what are their expectations and needs out of infrastructure and infrastructure services.
So one of the questions or comments that was made in the previous session was about how we think about changing the infrastructure pipeline, if you like, to start embedding some of the opportunities, like technology opportunities that, and to put a fine point on it, the comment was made was that you can't tender for a project and assume that you're going to get a digital twin without being really specific that you want a digital twin. So if you look at your third sort of criteria performance for performance, which is future looking, are you seeing that your work on that as a factor in driving value is changing the way that people are thinking about contracting for infrastructure projects?
I think it's still very early days. I think it's having an impact with respect to taking really long, hard look at that pipeline, and when you start to think about because this is another issue for us, is really we start to take a look at the critical path around all of the assurance and the assessments and the length of time it takes to actually get a project from conception to actually being shovel ready. That's a considerable amount of time. And that future needs analysis, we're saying the world is changing. And the world is changing not at pace, but quicker and quicker and quicker. So the ability to try to take the future needs analysis, have a pipeline, and have an element of agility in being able to be a little bit more proactive, I think is critically important. So I think there is that element of looking at innovations, but it's also looking at our markets, right? And where are our markets headed? Where's the world headed? So we're trying to get those kind of lenses in there, because too often I don't think it's as bad in Australia as it is in Canada, but our infrastructure processes have been very, very static. Right, and what we've talked about a lot over here is to say that if we continue on the path that we're on right now, we might continue to build the post-World War II infrastructure, as opposed to the infrastructure that's needed for Canada in 2050 and that Canadians will expect in 2050. So there is this lens where we're really trying to challenge the way we think about our pipeline, the way we think about having flexibility, but also about how can we speed things up, because the world is changing. It is changing very quickly, and we need to remain abreast of that, because that's what really, in our opinion, makes, we've done work in the private sector and the public sector, but what makes infrastructure particularly challenging is you're talking about material investments over a long period of time when the world is changing very rapidly. So it's very difficult to kind of square that circle, but we've got to give it our level best.
Well, thanks, Azfar. I knew we were going to whip through some important questions with you and quickly run out of time. But thank you for joining us from Canada and nighttime in your neck of the woods. I'm going to pause here and give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find your reports, including the work that you've been doing on measuring return on infrastructure projects.
Oh, no, thank you so much, and just really thanks to you and CEDA for the opportunity. You can find our work at ifsd.ca and then /infrastructure. Our work is there, and please, it's got all of our contact details. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Great, thanks so much, and enjoy your evening.